All right, everybody. Here's that moment of truth where we wait for the internet to wake up. And there's a lull. I know. There is a lull. But let's see who's first today. Looks like YouTube's gonna win. So Twitter always wins. Periscope is always first. YouTube was definitely in second today. And Rockfin, you were third. Not a competition, but Rockfin, you were third. What's up, everybody? Good afternoon to all my East Coasters. Good morning to all my West Coasters. My guest today is also on the West Coast. And good evening if you're in an evening time zone. And to everybody in the future, Australia, New Zealand, you're in the future. You've had an extra day of science. We're counting on you to fix climate change. Text me the solution. I'll share it with everybody else. One world, right? Shout out to our friends who make this show possible, our friends over at Indie Left. Indie Left is the only place to find all the content creators and streamers you know and love compiled into one convenient list. They update it twice a day. They curate all the news for you. Super convenient. To find out everything they got going on and to join their Discord community, go to independentleft.media. That's independentleft.media. Also want to mention I did their theme song. So if you enjoy their theme song, that was me. Also, our friends over at ZT.com, ZHITEA.com. Their T kind of rules. Ron T, it's coming. Stay tuned. Ron T is coming. All right, without further ado, my guest today, I am super excited to talk to this guy. He is an author. He is a journalist. He is a blogger. His blog now is called Pluralistic, and he is a digital rights advocate. Please welcome to the show, Cory Doctorow. Cory, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks so much for doing this. I'm excited to talk to you. So, I want to start just super basic because I'm curious to know this. Um, what got you into this space in the first place? I mean, you have been, in this space and on top of these issues for a long time now. What got you into it in the first place?
Well, like I tell young computer science students who ask me about getting a career in the industry, if you don't have the foresight and good judgment to be born in 1971, I can't really help you. Being born in 71, and especially having a dad who was a computer scientist, meant that I had an Apple II Plus in 1979 and grew up with modems and BBSs and just was always very interested in technology, which was fringe activity until it wasn't. And then it was like the white hot center of industry. And there were employers who were very anxious to bring people in, irrespective of their formal credentials. So after going to weird-ass alternative schools in Toronto for a long time, I dropped out of 4 undergraduate programs, ended up working as a programmer, started some early web companies, then did a tech startup, and then ended up through that startup working with the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is a digital rights group. And that kind of merged the other strain of my growing up, which was political activism, human rights activism, and activism related to anti-nuclear proliferation. Growing up in Canada, that was a very big issue because of our role in supplying uranium and also our role in NORAD and cruise missile testing and so on. And so this long-standing work that I'd had in activism on traditional progressive issues and technology really came together with Electronic Frontier Foundation. A couple of years later, I moved to Europe to be their European director, and have been active with them off and on ever since. It's been nearly 20 years now. And at the same time, I was writing and publishing. I started selling stories to science fiction magazines as a teenager, doing journalism, first entertainment journalism, then more investigative work, and now kind of mix of opinion, a little bit of investigation. And got involved in starting one of the first very successful blogs, Boing Boing, which I still co-own and worked on daily for 19 years until last year. And so all of those things just stitched together. It was a very lucky moment. I was like born in the right time at the right place. I had parents who had benefited enormously from a big social services network that saw my parents, who both came from very working class backgrounds. My father was a refugee, end up with tertiary education and a good union jobs as teachers. That meant that, I had a lot of comfort to pursue things that were interesting to me. And it paid off really well. It turned me into someone who was able to chart a course that didn't exist when I started charting it, right? To find something new.
So I wanted to ask you about the EFF specifically a little later, but since it came up naturally, I'll ask you about that now. Can you kind of go into detail about the Electronic Frontier Foundation, what it is all about, what their mission is, how it has evolved since you've been part of it, and your role in it?
So EFF is one of the very oldest of the digital rights organizations, and it comes out of this moment really early on when there were a lot of questions being raised about how human rights and civil rights would apply in the digital world. And some people said, well, we wouldn't need them, right? Like maybe we could use cryptography to make governments irrelevant, and then we wouldn't need to secure ourselves from them, nor from other people who wanted to do us harm, and we could just sort of live this kind of digitally maintained paradise. That was not EFF's position. There were other people who said it was irrelevant, right? That to talk about human rights in the same breath as technology is to somehow elevate like the arguments of sad nerds about Star Trek to, Martin Luther King crossing the bridge and having Bull Connor's dog set on him. And that's not where real human rights work takes place. And EFF's founders, who were some pretty early technology pioneers, they had the idea that human rights and digital rights would merge. That as the internet became more central to our lives, that those two things would become the same thing. And so they argued a string of very important early cases. They won the Steve Jackson Games case, which was the case that said that if the police seize an email server, they need a warrant to read the email. It came out of a hilarious, weird thing where in Austin, Texas, there was an RPG publisher who published like tabletop Dungeons and Dragons style games called Steve Jackson. And the FBI raided them because they thought that their cyberpunk tabletop game might have some nexus with cybercrime, and seized their BBS and started reading their email. More importantly, EFF won a really important early lawsuit that legalized civilian access to cryptography and ended the NSA's ban on strong cryptographic tools in civilian hands, which is how there's a little S in the HTTPS in your browser bar right now. That's that cryptography that we legalized. And since then, we've fought a lot of important high-profile cases, and we continue to do that work. When I started with EFF, it was literally half a dozen people. Now it's about 100. And I am always amazed at what my colleagues there are working on. We publish software tools. We litigate, we work on international treaties, we have affiliations with other groups like ours all over the world, and we have a national network within the US called the Electronic Frontiers Alliance of community groups that work autonomously but collectively with us to attain local goals related to digital technology and human rights. For example, restrictions on the police use of facial recognition technology, or just requirements that the cops put out to tender a public notice when they decide to buy new digital surveillance technology, whether that's a fake cell phone tower that can sniff your cell phone as you move through time and space, or a license plate camera, or much more nefarious hacking tools. And so all that work goes on today, and it's the intersection of law, policy, and technology, and we have hackers and lawyers and activists like me, and we all work together.
Yeah, it's one of those things. When I started coming around to these issues, it would have been around 2005 or so. So by that point, EFF was a big player on campus, and But then when you trace the timeline, and you see that it goes back to, I believe, 1990.
Mm-hmm.
You just kind of like, you look at that and you just think, wow, they really had some foresight, and I don't know how they pulled this off. I'm thrilled they did, but I don't know how.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I think that I kind of poo-pooed the kind of cyber utopian vision, but there is an element of cyber utopianism in EFF, which is to say that its early founders and staffers and supporters, as well as those today, weren't just scared about how technology might be abused to take away things that are important to the human struggle for justice and freedom, but also they were excited about what technology gave them, right? They had found online friendship, love, the ability to gather people around causes, just camaraderie and all kinds of things that were worth fighting for. And the very early response to technology from lawmakers and from law enforcement, and to a lesser extent from intelligence agencies, was very bad. And so there was this kind of perfect storm where you have people who really cared about this stuff, who'd found in it some really important potential for living their best life, for technological self-determination, who felt a really significant threat because, you had lawmakers who were just like, not just clueless, because you can be a clueless lawmaker on a technical subject and still make good law, right? Like, no one in Congress has a microbiology degree, and yet somehow they manage to pass laws and regulations that keep us from all dying of giardia when we drink our tap water, right? But just willfully clueless, just like wrong in really important ways. Like in 1986, Ronald Reagan signed the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, America's first landmark cybersecurity statute. It's a really bad law. It continues to be abused today. It's a real serious thorn in everyone's side. Reagan was stampeded into signing that law after seeing Matthew Broderick in the movie War Games, and panicking that America wouldn't be able to fight hacking crimes. And so that was the level of discourse, right? So unlike, say, water safety, where you might expect a microbiologist to come and advise some staffers and an expert regulator and so on, you just had Ronald Reagan watching VHS cassettes of Matthew Broderick hacking the Whopper and signing laws off the back of that. And I think that really made people realize that they would have to fight, right? That they could lose a lot if they didn't.
Well, I think when it comes to digital rights, I always make the joke. It's you look at Marjorie Taylor Greene and you realize we have two types of elected officials when it comes to digital rights: people who don't understand the internet and people who can't handle the internet. And they're making our laws. And I think in a lot of ways that's true. But to your point, I think that it also just comes down to asking the right questions of the right people. You don't need to be like engulfed in digital rights if you're an elected official to just, make good policy. You just have to ask the right people, folks like the EFF, folks like Free Press, folks like Fight for the Future. The organizations are out there. They're available. You just have to ask them. And so many people don't bother taking that step, especially people with power.
I think it's actually worse because oftentimes they will hear from experts and then disregard them because someone has come along to offer some wishful thinking. So, like a couple of areas where this happens a lot. One is internet voting, which is a terrible thing that no one should ever talk about doing because it's stupid and we can't do it. Like, there's a pretty broad consensus among the computer science community that is just never going to work, because maintaining a ballot that is both secret and secure and remote is just, it's a mug's game. We shouldn't have touchscreen voting machines. We shouldn't have online voting. We should be, to the greatest extent possible, counting slips of paper. That's how we do it in Canada, where I grew up. It's how we do it in the UK, where I lived for 13 years. Lots of advanced democracies do it. There are some problems with the complexity of American ballots that might require you to maybe break that stuff down. But in terms of not just the risk to elections, but the risk to the legitimacy of an election, which is something that we're really living through right now, not that an election was stolen, but that credible claims about stolen elections have delegitimized an election for a large proportion of the population. That risk from digital technology is far too high. We should just not do it. And yet there are a lot of vendors, right? And those vendors are pretty concentrated. ES&S is the largest of them. They're really the elephant in the room here. And like all monopolists, they extract a lot of money because monopolists don't have to compete on price, and so they can charge more. Like all monopolists, they don't have to settle a lot of intra-industry disagreements in order to spend that money to attain policy. And so you have this like very unified chorus calling for more digital technology in our elections, when really we should be having much less digital technology in our elections. Or, the very long-standing idiotic dream of intelligence agencies and law enforcement to backdoor our encryption. So to say that we should have encryption that works perfectly if criminals are trying to break into your data, whether they're trying to break into a government agency or trying to break into your personal data, but it should fail catastrophically the minute criminals use it to protect their own data. And that somehow we can have encryption that both works perfectly and fails catastrophically depending on who uses it, which again is a thing that like the computer science community is about as unified on this as the climate science community is on the idea of anthropogenic climate change. And just like with anthropogenic climate change, if you shop hard enough, you can find a few people who, because they're cranks or because they're on someone's payroll or because they have a sincerely held wrong belief, will say that the impossible is possible. But, you know, the overwhelming technical consensus of both government computer scientists and computer scientists who work in elite institutions and with the largest corporations is that this is just an idiotic, incoherent idea. It's been around since the Clinton years. So 25 years later, we are still arguing about it. And that, you know, is not a failure to ask the right people. It's a failure to listen to them. Yesterday, Australia's security minister said that there is no reason that anyone should need strong encryption. Now Australia is a particularly egregious offender. They had a prime minister a couple of years ago who, when they were informed that the laws of mathematics mean that you can't make strong crypto that doesn't work when criminals use it, he said, and I quote, "The laws of mathematics are all very well and good, but I think you'll find that in Australia, the law of Australia is the law." So math can go fuck itself.
That's a heavy stand.
Yeah.
That's a pretty heavy stand.
I've heard a lot of stupid things said about tech policy, but honestly, like, if we ever bring the Olympics back, Australia should compete on stupid technology policy pronouncements because they will bring home the gold.
You think they'll even beat out the United States?
Oh, hell yeah. No. Australia is a country where once you start going, oh, that's the Texas of Australia, you realize that there's like at least 5 Texases of Australia.
Fair enough. So right now, like, you would say it's pretty much paper ballots or bust right now.
I mean, there's a place maybe in the world for a human readable ballot marking device. There are some problems with human readable ballot marking devices, but there's a place for them. You know, the big question that always comes up when we talk about US elections and paper ballots is that tallying a complex paper ballot is hard when you have 25 different issues on it, right? When there's a bunch of ballot initiatives and a whole bunch of different races and so on. And so, you know, this argument goes that you can have paper ballot marking devices that then produce a machine readable ballot that you can count automatically, but that you can hand recount, though it will be very complex. And then you get the best of both worlds. I think that this is not great. I think that, you know, that waiting an extra couple hours while a more complex hand tallying is undertaken might be preferable. It's an area where we could do some empirical research, like we could find out what the error rate is on hand tallying ballots of the complexity that we see in US regional elections. I've only just applied for US naturalization, so I've never cast a ballot in this country. I've only seen sample ballots. So I'll have a more informed opinion when I finally get to actually go down to my local ballot box and cast a vote.
So I wanted to ask you a question about that based on something I saw on your Wikipedia page. This is kind of just a fun one for you, I hope. I saw on your Wikipedia page, so let me know if this is actually correct, where you left England and part of your grievance was you were saying how conservative England was getting and how it was becoming just this kind of haven for big banks and big business. But you decided to come to the United States. I mean, unpack that for me, because to me that sounds like someone being like, "I am so sick of spaghetti. I'm moving to Italy."
Yeah, no, I hear your point. It wasn't England specifically. It was central London. So okay. I lived in a neighborhood in central London where we saw the systematic removal of the kinds of offices and homes and business places that allowed normal people to live, in service to just converting most of central London to like empty safe deposit boxes in the sky and WeWorks that were, you know, owned by offshore real estate investment trusts and dirty money from kleptocrats, while it became harder and harder for just normal people, even people with good middle-class jobs, to survive. And became pretty clear that the administration of Greater London viewed human beings as an inconvenience to banks. and that the primary reason for London's existence was finance. So I didn't move to another finance capital. I now live in an entertainment capital, which is Los Angeles, which has its own problems. California has a really serious housing problem, but it's hard to convey. Although maybe now with the real estate bubble it's starting to catch up, but it's hard to convey just how thoroughly the United Kingdom's politics had been disordered by the conversion of housing from a human right into the primary asset that people rely on not to starve when they get old, and how completely backwards the country had become as a result. So deadlocked on NIMBYism and the ability to build high density infill, deadlocked on transit, deadlocked on what to do about mounting homelessness. All that sounds familiar if you lived in Los Angeles, but sure. as a matter of degree, I'm actually here to tell you that, California's passed like a statewide rent control bill. We have anti-eviction laws all through the region, with the exception of a couple of small towns, which were then overridden by state law. We do have really significant initiatives to build both public transit and long-haul high-speed rail.
Do you think
and
they'll
so
go
on.
Anywhere? I mean, we've been talking about it forever.
Well, they're building subways in LA. Like, that's actually happening, right? They've broken ground. Whether we'll get dedicated bus lanes, which is, what LA absolutely needs, that remains to be seen. The problem isn't helped by charlatans like Elon Musk, who maintain the pretense that somehow we're going to be able to do this all with private vehicles because, as Musk likes to say, when you get on a public bus, you might have to sit next to a serial killer. I mean, the problem for Musk.
I don't remember him saying that, but that's something he would say.
Oh yeah, the problem for Musk is that geometry has a well-known socialist bias, and if you add up the square footage occupied by a single person vehicle for every person in LA, irrespective of how small you want to make that vehicle, and then multiply it by the amount of road surface that you need, you end up in this Red Queen's race where everything gets farther apart to accommodate the roads, and then you need more roads because people have to travel further. And, I used to work for Disney Imagineering. My wife works for Disney. I spent a lot of time going back and forth to Disneyland from LA. And as someone who has watched 25, 30 years of lane widening construction on Highway 5, I'm here to tell you, it doesn't matter how many lanes you add to Highway 5. Highway 5 is going to be like a Hieronymus Bosch painting with cars forever, right? And,
that's fair.
We're up to, I don't know, like 78 lanes or something on stretches of the 5, and it's still a parking lot. So, I just think that, there is no way to solve a problem like Los Angeles without transit. Now, the good news for a place that's as bad as LA is that if you can turn every one-person car ride into a two-person car ride, you literally chop the amount of traffic in half. It's hard to get those gains, right? Getting a 100% gain with a single intervention is that's a big deal. You don't get a lot of those, right? The next time we add one person to a car, it'll only be a 50% gain, and then it just goes down from there geometrically. But for now, there's a lot of easy wins that LA could have. We've just had a pretty landmark land use rule set out for LA County, where they approved a bunch of standardized additional dwelling units like granny flats, and told city councils that they weren't allowed to refuse planning permission if you had a lot size that could accommodate them. And really, at the stroke of a pen, you can now double the housing density of most of LA County, right? Which is pretty wild, right? It's going to take a lot of work to double it again, but that first doubling came pretty easy.
That is encouraging. I mean, because the flip side to everything you're just saying is the overbloated budget for the LAPD, the sweeps that they're spending millions of dollars on that could go to housing. So yeah, I mean, we're certainly not without our problems, and we have a long way to go. But it is, well, since you brought up California specific policy, can I get your take on the potential broadband infrastructure that the governor's been talking about?
Yeah, I am really, really bullish on this potential broadband infrastructure bill. This is the kind of thing that can really make a difference. Back again to Elon Musk being a charlatan, The other problem Elon Musk has is that physics has a well-known socialist bias, and there is only so much electromagnetic spectrum, which means that if you want to provide the kind of bandwidth that Musk is claiming that he'll give to people, and you want to do it at scale, you need a whole bunch of satellites, and they can't overlap too much, because then they start interfering with each other. And if you just keep like widening the bandwidth and just or adding more radio energy to the the connection between the satellites and ground stations, you either end up increasing the amount of interference, you raise the noise floor and you make it harder for individual satellites to communicate with ground stations, and or you increase the amount of ambient radio energy in the sky that so to such an extent that like birds start falling out of the sky pre-cooked, right? So there are some like really hard limits on what we can do with satellites, and the math doesn't add up for what Musk is promising. Meanwhile, fiber is seriously future-proofed. The baseline for a strand of fiber is 100 gigabits, and it gets faster from that. And if you pull conduit, then it gets faster still, because now what you can do is, instead of dropping a single fiber down in the ground and then having to dig it all up again if you need a second fiber, you have a pipe, and you can fish a lot of fiber through that pipe. You can fish a braided rope of fiber as thick as a baby's arm through that pipe, and now you've got the kind of bandwidth that might see us through, really to the middle of the next century. And one of the things that we know from American history and from the history of all like widely dispersed countries is that when you provide these utilities universally, the way we did, say, with electrification or roads, you completely transform the character of communities, and you completely transform the sense of cohesion among the communities. There's a lot of data right now about how badly people have fared because they lived in broadband deserts during the pandemic, during the lockdown, because they couldn't access things. And those broadband deserts, they didn't occur merely because it was uneconomical to reach those towns or those remote places. They occurred because the disorderliness of the monopolized market for telecoms sort of doomed them. One of the things that happened pretty early in the pandemic is that Frontier, which was, I think, arguably like the second worst cable operator in America.
Well, when you go into those weeds, you can get lost really quick. Because I've had that discussion amidst like other friends who work for digital rights organizations, where it's like, well, who actually is the worst?
So Frontier, when the thing about the Frontier that made them so especially bad is, as the other major carriers were monopolizing, were buying up all the regionals, they were often forced by the FTC or the DOJ to sell off some kind of remote holdings that they had, some remote franchises that they had. And Frontier went around and gobbled them all up from like Verizon and AT&T. They bought all these little out of the way franchises for places that were remote, rural, marginalized, disadvantaged, declining, right? Places that were already like at coming up from behind and who needed a boost. And Frontier, like most large corporations, paid its executive ranks primarily in stock and only secondarily in cash. And that made their executives extremely beholden to Wall Street analysts, because if a Wall Street analyst nixes a plan that you've made, then your stock goes down and you can't afford to pay your mortgage or, buy another swimming pool or like buy your kid a horse or whatever it is CEOs do, right? And so one of the things that we learned when Frontier went bankrupt and it had to publish its financials, its internals, is that they had a plan to profitably connect 1 million households to 100 gigabit fiber for a $1 billion investment that would yield an $800 million investment over a 10-year amortization period. So in other words, they had an $800 million payday waiting for them, and they had access to the capital to build it. But they deliberately chose to leave those families on some of the worst copper infrastructure in the country. Like literally, you see photos of Frontier infrastructure, and it's copper wires wrapped in newspaper, dipped in tar, and draped over shrubs. And they decided not to upgrade those families because Wall Street analysts don't like capex that amortizes over more than 5 years. So the analysts who controlled their share price would have downrated their stock if they had made a profitable investment that would have yielded $800 million. And then they doomed 1 million, I beg your pardon, it was 3 million families to this old copper infrastructure. We also learned that they had 1 million families that they understood to have no alternative. So these were places where there wasn't a cable operator to create a duopoly, where there was only a DSL monopoly. And they booked those internally as assets because they understood that those customers could not choose to go somewhere else. And so irrespective of how much they charged and irrespective of how unreliable and slow their service was, they could keep those customers, right? So this issue about remote places not having broadband, it's not merely about whether it's profitable. It's about this wildly distorted and monopolized market, a kind of naturally monopolized market, right? Because generally speaking, if one company lays the mid-haul and long-haul and then local infrastructure for telecoms, no one else is going to invest in doing it. And so that's one of the reasons that in many parts of the world, you have a firm that is either a government spinoff or a government public-private partnership or a regulated monopoly that does that infrastructure, and then other firms operate service on top of it as a way of creating markets in the places where a market can function, and we don't leave to the market those places that produce natural monopolies.
Yeah, the way I like to kind of break it down when I talk about these issues on my show is, look, I don't have the tech acumen to explain how exactly we build broadband, but I know that it's not some unattainable feat. When you hear these
Sure.
stories, I mean, hey, over in the UK, there was that group of farmers. They weren't happy with what was available to them. They laid their own fiber and built this like top-notch network. So it can be done. We just have more or less, I think an organized duopoly is a good way to describe it.
Yeah.
It is basically what our cable arrangement is. And they're focused on profit. So they just, they look at a community and if they feel like they're not going to get the margins they want to see, they just don't invest there.
But they also collude to underinvest, right?
Oh,
So if one
totally.
doesn't invest, the other one doesn't have to invest, and so they have these cozy arrangements. You saw this with Frontier and Verizon in New York City, where at one point, not Frontier, I beg your pardon, Spectrum Charter. At one point, Spectrum Charter actually was kicked out of New York State altogether by the regulator for its egregious falsehoods, underinvestment, and failure to supply the service that was mandated. So, I live in Burbank, and Burbank is it's a 100,000 person autonomous municipal entity that's right up against Hollywood. Like I can see North Hollywood from my front door, and it gives us kind of the best of all worlds. We have North Hollywood over there, and we have our own political unit over here. And generally it's pretty functional, but one place where it's really busted is in fiber. So Burbank had a really visionary idea. They floated a municipal bond and they built out 100 gigabit fiber network, and it serves the large businesses, the airport, Disney, Warner, Universal.
It's not
really
residential though at this point, is it?
So that's where I was headed. It runs under the foundation slab I'm sitting on, and I'm not connected to it because we have done a deal with Charter where they have the exclusive remit to terminate broadband connections on residential premises. So even though I have a business and I pay for a business license, and because this is zoned as a private home, I cannot get broadband from the fiber that my municipal taxes pay for, right? Like, because the coupon on that bond comes out of our municipal taxes. So we pay we're still amortizing that investment, but we're not accessing that investment. And, if you believe that businesses or the government should run like a business, this makes no sense. If you believe the government should run for the public good, this makes no sense.
Right.
This makes no sense, right? Like this is incoherent no matter where you are on the political spectrum. And so, and I think that local politicians really underestimate the extent to which broadband is a vote getter. Like, I understand that if you go to the doorstep and you say, I'm going to give you broadband, people will be like, oh, that's nice. I hate my cable operator. But if you could actually deliver it, right? Like the massive change in the way people live when they have symmetrical 100 gigabit.
Go talk to people in Chattanooga, Tennessee.
Yeah. Or, there's a county in Pennsylvania that it's the poorest white majority county in the world, or in the country rather. It's an Appalachian county where they got some Fed money and they built out a municipal fiber network using the corporate infrastructure left behind by their old New Deal era electrification and telephone co-op.
Really?
Which
I'm
is
not
still
familiar with
extant.
that one. I
And
gotta look. I'm from Pennsylvania. I gotta look that up.
they pulled fiber. It's Kentucky Pennsylvania border, so they pulled fiber to every house in the county, including places at the tops of mountains. And they used a mule called Old Bub to pull fiber up mountain passes that were inaccessible by motorized vehicles. And they put fiber in every premise in the county. And the median wage shot up to $25 an hour because they got all kinds of telework, right? There are entire
No kidding.
upper middle class communities in China whose children are learning to speak English with thick Appalachian accents because that's where they're doing language classes remotely.
You don't remember the name of the county? I gotta look this up.
I'll look it up. I'll find, if you Google Old Bub Fiber, OLEBUB, Fiber Appalachia, it will be easy enough to find.
Yeah, I grew up in Pittsburgh, so I'm surprised. I mean, like I try to follow all of this the best I can. I mean, I follow the Institute of Local Self-Reliance, and I follow, and I know like in Charlemont, Massachusetts, they set Comcast packing. They were like, yeah, we see what you're offering. We're gonna say no thanks and do this ourselves. And that's why I always tell people, I'm like, look, it's not a one size fits all thing. This could be done in a town of 7,000 or Los Angeles.
Yeah.
Like it's not, and I it's cool. It's interesting you bring up Burbank. I used to live in Pasadena. I live in San Pedro now, and I presented on municipal broadband at a city hall meeting. Like I just showed up and I was like, we should have municipal broadband, and I just kind of gave a spiel about it. And there were enough people that were for it that they put it on a city agenda. And to their credit, they conducted this study, but it was a bit limited. And they came back and they said, well, Beverly Hills is building a fiber to the home thing. This is how much that is going to cost them. We multiplied it by the mileage of Pasadena, decided we can't afford this. And Burbank tried to do something, but it's only for businesses. And sorry, we can't afford this. And that was it. And so, I kind of made the case. I'm like, look, this is a very limited case study here. I appreciate you doing it, but I think we got to keep the conversation going.
And a ton of that is just bookkeeping, right? So, when you talk about rights of way or road disruption, a lot of those are pro forma numbers, right? So obviously the city doesn't have to pay the city when the city takes over one of the city streets to dig it up, and they have to pay the city workers. But the license fee that a utility might pay to block off your street and dig a trench to stick fiber in it is not is like, even if they have a pro forma accounting convention where the city bills itself for that, all that's happening is money is moving from one city account to the other. And rights of way and licensing, those are a huge piece of the overall cost here. So generally speaking, if a city wants to show that it's not economically viable, it's not hard to do that. But it just is an accounting fiction rather than an actual hard constraint.
Yeah. In other words, we can afford it if we want it. If we really want to do this,
we can have nice things. We can have nice things. To say nothing of the economic opportunity, so back to the pandemic, the number of editors, sound editors, SFX people, and so on, who after a couple of weeks into the pandemic, when it became clear they weren't going back into their offices, went to the office and brought home their render station and started editing from there, only to discover that they couldn't move assets back and forth to the studio because they had throttled upstream, right? Because they had copper infrastructure that just doesn't support high-speed uploads. It kneecapped the studios and to a much greater extent the supply chain of the studios, the independent firms that are all up and down, Olive Street and Burbank Boulevard and so on, that do effects, sound, and so on, who really rely on that high-speed broadband and who couldn't, do what they used to do, which is have their editors come in on site and then, in extremis, just like drive a hard drive down the block to, the gates of Warner or Disney.
Mm-hmm. It's so interesting. And like you're saying, it's like you can argue it from any political perspective too.
Sure.
If you choose to. Like I talk about municipal broadband, I'm like, look, I'm a very left-wing guy, but this is not a left-wing or a right-wing issue. You can argue it from any perspective.
Oh, yeah.
There was that mini documentary that came out recently about that small town in North Carolina who was talking about like, hey, the
Yep.
internet's a utility in our life. We need to treat it like one. This is like
Yep.
back in the day when only so many people had electricity. They're saying the same things
Yep.
folks like you and I are saying. And it's like the country. Well, let me ask you one other question on this topic.
Sure.
Does the California, the infrastructure proposal, does it prioritize municipal building?
So what it is it builds out the middle hall. So it does the interurban links, and then it creates pools of patient capital. So very low interest borrowing pools that amortize over 40 years, along with expertise banks. So your local town can borrow all the money it needs to do the local rollout, amortized over 40 years at low interest from a loan from the state, because the state's got access to a lot of capital right now.
Mm-hmm.
And then they also get state level expertise to help them figure out how to plan their rollout and maintain their rollout and train local people to maintain the rollout. So, when you live in a city in the valley or on the coast, it's not going to be hard for you to find people who can operate your local network. But if you live in a real small town out in the Central Valley, agricultural town, there may not be anyone there right now who knows how to do it. But it's not like those people are stupid, right? They just need some training. And so it will provide the training, and it'll provide the infrastructure, and it'll provide the procedures and so on to help them do it. So this is exactly how electrification rolled out. So I wanted to mention one other thing, because you were talking about the bipartisan nature of broadband. I think that the greatest self-own that the American right ever experienced was blocking municipal and state fiber initiatives. Because the reason we don't have municipal and state fiber is not that it's like a hard case to make. It's that ALEC promulgated model legislation to a bunch of states that the states then enacted that banned cities from building out fiber with public money. So that you could have these duopolists that would operate instead and gouge people. And today you have the same people who kind of briefed for that complaining about big tech and deplatforming. And you know what? Like, I was complaining about big tech and deplatforming back when it was trans activists and sex workers who didn't want to use their real name and pipeline activists and so on. Like, deplatforming is an actual problem. Like, we don't want one company deciding who gets to participate in our public discourse, because I guarantee you, if you are progressive, you are not going to be on the same side as that company 99.999% of the time.
Right.
The fact that they got rid of Alex Jones and Milo Yiannopoulos is not much comfort when you think about all the people whose names you don't know because they got kicked off years and years ago.
Well, so we're seeing that right now with all these Palestinian rights pages.
Yeah, 100%.
I mean,
yeah,
and everyone,
Yeah, for sure. Right. Your political clout translates directly to your ability to resist deplatforming or moderation or content removal. And the people progressives care about, by definition, don't have a lot of political clout. So, that's always going to be a problem. But you know what? If you had 100 gigabit fiber drop in your garage, you wouldn't need all these other services to host your, weird COVID denial forum. You could just stick a cheap ass server in your garage and host you and 50,000 friends on it pretty straightforwardly, right? Like the main reason we have these vast content distribution networks is because broadband is concentrated into a few big data interchanges and a few data centers. There is a lot of stuff at the mid scale, right? Not Facebook scale, but like at the mid scale, where you could run a significant amount of service out of a very modest investment in hardware and expertise, particularly because so much of that infrastructure can be remotely managed. So you can install the hardware, and then you could hire remote admins to manage the hardware and lock it down for you and so on. It wouldn't solve all of their problems, and some of them would get hacked and some of their servers would fall over and so on. But the funneling of all of our connectivity into a few places really did set up this infrastructure where we're going to have these gatekeepers. And I think it probably was a reasonably safe bet on the part of people who represent the interests of wealthy, powerful people, that gatekeepers would be on their side, but not always, right? Not always. And don't act surprised when they're not on your side and you find that there's no way around the gatekeepers, because that's the system you created.
So I want to ask you one more question, and then I'm hoping
Sure.
you'll be able to take a couple viewer questions too, because
Sure.
they're pretty advanced, and you do a better job answering them than me.
Uh-huh.
What is surveillance capitalism when you use that term, and how
Uh,
do we end it?
yeah, so there's competing definitions of this, right? The first place where it appeared, as far as anyone can tell, was this progressive journal published by these British Columbia academics, where they used it as a critique of capitalism itself. And then Shoshana Zuboff, who's a Harvard Business School professor, popularized a different sense of it. She popularized the idea that surveillance capitalism was a rogue capitalism. And by this, she meant that if the theory of capitalism is that a market aggregates all the choices that people make that reflect how much they want things and what they're willing to give up to get them, the marginal revolution that they call it, then produces these kind of efficient allocations by aggregating all that information and in a kind of self-ordering system, this invisible hand, then surveillance capitalism is rogue, because by gathering a lot of data on us through surveillance, big tech companies can influence us, can determine our behavior. So rather than making our behavior, rather than aggregating our free choices, these firms are able to influence our choice or determine our choice, so that we don't have the system that produces these allocations. And I wrote a little book. I used to have a copy next to my camera so I can hold it up. Oh, there it is. I wrote a little book called How to Destroy Surveillance Capitalism. That's a critique of this idea, because I think that the evidence that big tech can influence our choices through influence campaigns is pretty thin. Like the peer-reviewed evidence is that one study where Facebook exposed 60 million people to a message that they thought would make them vote. And then they found that across the 60 million people, about 200,000 or 300,000 more people than they expected to vote did go out and vote. That sounds impressive. Obviously, there are a lot of elections that have been carried on less than 200, 300,000 votes, but it was 0.36% of the people in the experiment, and they were spread out across all precincts. So there aren't any elections that have been won by a 0.36% margin. And we should probably expect that if you repeatedly expose someone to a stimulus, that it will become less effective, not more. I've got a little note by my camera here, because this is my garage, which is also my office, which is also the laundry room. And the note says, turn off the washing machine, because I don't hear it after the first 5 minutes. But of course, everyone else can hear it. And that's what all stimulus becomes, right? You stop noticing stimulus with repetition. So there's at least a pretty good idea that if the initial outing was 0.39%, that the second outing would be less impactful and less and less. The first banner ad had a 50% click-through rate, and it's significantly less than 1% today, right? So that evidence that it's actually working is pretty thin. The fact that Facebook conducted a experiment on 60 million people without their consent does militate for the idea that they shouldn't be running a lemonade stand, much less the social lives of 2.6 billion people. But it doesn't mean they've got a mind control ray. And all the other evidence is just self-serving marketing hype, right? It's stuff that Google and Facebook say to people who they hope will buy ads about how well those ads work. And that evidence is even thinner, right? And, one of the things we're learning through all these antitrust suits, particularly the one in Texas, is that they lie like crazy to advertisers. Like, ad fraud is off the hook crazy. Like, the ads are seen by no one. They're never displayed. Like the outcomes that are supposedly tracked through what's called attribution tracking are works of fiction. You have giant companies like eBay that cut $100 million worth of targeted ad spending and saw no change to their sales figures. Also, giant packaged good companies like Procter and Gamble that just they just eliminate all their digital ad spend and nothing changes in their sales. That really suggests that these stories are overblown. But big tech, I think, does cause us to change our behavior, but they don't do it by persuading us. They do it by monopolizing us, right? So like when all your friends are on Facebook, and when Facebook blocks all interoperability, the only way to talk to your friends is to join Facebook. So we join Facebook, right? And our friends are on Facebook because we're there, and we're there because our friends are there. We've all taken each other hostage, and we can't leave, right? And that's just monopolism. And when people do manage to leave, like millions of people left Facebook and went to Instagram, Facebook then just buys Instagram. So
Right.
you're back inside of Facebook. The fact that like everyone who has a question answers it by typing it into Google means that Google has enormous influence over what we believe. Google maintains its dominance as a search engine by spending billions and billions of dollars to exclude rivals, right? The one deal that Google and Apple's CEOs do in person, Tim Cook and Sundar Pichai do in person every year, is the deal where Google gives billions of dollars to Apple to be the default search option on Apple's devices. So, there's just no way to escape. So these are just monopolistic tactics. These are things that were banned, under the successive American administrations from the New Deal until the Reagan era. And then Reagan repealed them, and every president since, both Democratic and Republican, has made those rules even weaker. And you have companies like Google that have made 1.5 successful products, where they made a search engine and a pretty good Hotmail clone, that are nevertheless dominating multiple sectors by acquiring nascent competitors and merging with major competitors, both of those being activities that were traditionally prohibited under antitrust law. If Google hadn't been allowed to buy its competitors, it would have no YouTube, it would have no ad tech stack, would have no mobile product, right? It tried all of those things. It failed, right? Its internal versions of those things were disasters. The things that it does that are successful are things that it buys from someone else. It can't make a Wi-Fi balloon. It can't make an RSS reader. It can't make a social network. All it can do is buy those firms. So access to the capital markets and excessive profits from monopoly are what allow it to dominate us. And so, the reason that distinction matters is because if you believe Zuboff, then what we've got is like a comet hurtling towards the Earth. We don't want to break that comet up because it'll turn into like a killing meteor shower that will smash every city. So Zuboff says this, right? She says, if you break up the big ad tech surveillance platforms, you'll just end up with lots of people who have this ability to take away our free will. And so we can't use traditional anti-monopoly tactics. We have to instead try and steer the comet. We should turn them into like quasi-state-run entities, or maybe turn them into like something like AT&T, right? Regulated monopolies. But if you believe my hypothesis, then bringing out traditional antitrust enforcement and novel forms of antitrust enforcement that tech opens up, like mandating interoperability, as is countenanced in the US Access Act and the European Digital Markets Act and the UK Competition and Markets Authority proposals, that might actually get us somewhere, right? That we might actually be able to make these companies so weak that they can't dominate our policy, that maybe we could then pass a federal privacy bill with a private right of action that would make the kind of business that they're in illegal, which is what we really should do, because there's no way that they have our consent to do it. It inflicts major harm on us and on our society, and it's completely illegitimate. So I agree with her that the surveillance is bad. I just disagree with her about why they do it, what they get out of it, and what we need to do about it.
So here's a couple viewer questions here. This one's interesting, and I'm not equipped to answer this one. I don't know enough, but would it be possible to form ballots like owning NFT digital art? ? It seems like this would make your ballot tamper-proof.
Yeah, but it wouldn't make it secret.
Okay.
Like, that's the problem, right? Like, this is the triangle, right? Like, secret, authorized, and accountable, right? Like getting all three corners of the triangle is the hard part. You can do, like, if you don't care about ballot secrecy, you can do all kinds of great stuff. But if you don't care about ballot secrecy, then you have to contemplate the idea that husbands will force their wives to vote for Trump, or vice versa, or bosses will force their employees to vote for their candidates of choice. We already get this, right? Like, this is the reason that Amazon is having to go back to court over its Bessemer election, because we understand how you can pressurize someone at the ballot box, right? Like, the thing that they really didn't want Amazon to do, that Amazon was able to do, is call people into a mandatory meeting, tell them how they wanted them to vote for the union, hand their union ballots to them, and then walk them to the mailbox to put those ballots in the box.
The mailbox that the labor board said shouldn't be there. They put it there
right?
anyway. They had a key to it. They, if someone asked a pro-union question, they took your information. So we understand why it is that having an anonymous ballot, right, a secret ballot, is really important. And these aren't like hypothetical problems. So these are problems that actually take place in other elections, like union elections. And they're problems that have historically taken place in democratic national elections, political elections, where there wasn't ballot secrecy,
because the secret ballot is the thing that guards against many forms of significant coercion that would otherwise create permanent and durable advantages to powerful people over the people that they held in thrall to them.
All right. Thank you very much for that question. Duly noted. And thank you very much for the super chat contribution. You help keep this show on the air. This was a little lighter. Mad World 1962. Thank you so much for the super chat contribution. Hope all is well up in Canada. What is the best introductory book to learn about these issues?
Which ones?
Right. I mean,
There's
yeah.
so many. I mean, if you want
let's
to
go with
about
digital rights.
Even then, there's so many. So
Sure.
I'm trying to remember the title. Hang on. My colleague Jillian York just wrote an amazing book about let me find her book here. Silicon Values. That's it. She just wrote an amazing book about content moderation at scale and marginalized voices. So if you want to read about content moderation and speech and free expression, that's a great place to start.
What's it called again? I would
Silicon Values.
Silicon Valley. Oh, I like that. That's a cool title.
Yeah. I will put in a modest plug for How to Destroy Surveillance Capitalism. There are some really good chapters on tech monopoly in David Dian's book Monopolized. It ranges more widely than that. And then Tim Wu's book on monopoly, which is called The Curse of Bigness, which is just basically a little pamphlet, is also very good. More broadly on human rights, let me find the name of his book too. It's been a while since I read it. David Kay is the UN Special Rapporteur. Oh, that's it. David Kay is the UN Special Rapporteur on free speech and human rights. And he wrote a book called The Speech Police. That's, again, a very slim volume. There's a book, it's a couple of years old now, but Ron Diebert, who runs a thing called Citizen Lab, wrote a really good book on... and he's got his second book out too. I didn't like that one as much. It's good, but it's not as good as his first book. He wrote a really good book on how cyber mercenaries hire out to destroy the lives of human rights workers all over the world. It was called Black Code. It was a Random House book in 2013. And he's got a new book that is good, but I thought he gives a little too much credence to the surveillance capitalism hypothesis called Reset. That came out last year that's rather good as well. And there's one that hang on a second. I keep not finishing this book, but it's called How the Internet Really Works. And it's by Article 19, which is a free speech book. It comes from No Starch Press. And it's like this kind of book, right? It's like lots of diagrams and little bits of text, plain language. And it really just explains like how the underpinnings work and where they all come from and where they're taking us and some of the policy questions. I really like that. There's so many. I don't know, man. There isn't one like excellent primer on digital rights. It's become such a big question, right? Like the telecoms policy and speech policy, monopoly, cryptography, like all of these things kind of range all over the place. Like Snowden's memoir is amazing.
Yeah, I read that. That was a good book.
It's just a piece of the story, but it's an amazing book. And he did a young adult version that came out a couple of months ago. We did an event to launch it. That's fabulous. So if you've got, a 15-year-old in your life and you want to expose them to it, then that's a great idea.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I read that a little while ago, but yeah, that was a really good book. Well, that's an excellent start. So
good.
So there you go, Mad World. A lot of books to start with. Thank you so much, duly noted. Thank you so much, Mad World, for your super chat contributions. And Cory, thank you so. You come very highly requested, by the way. A lot of people have been, sending me emails telling me to get you on the show, and I love talking to you. This is. I hope you'll come back because there were a ton of topics I wanted to get to that we're not going to have time for today. So thank you so much for being here. Where can people go to follow you and learn more about you?
So I'm Doctorow on Twitter, and I have this daily blog called Pluralistic, and you can find it at pluralistic.net. It's syndicated to Twitter, Mastodon, Medium, Tumblr. It's also a newsletter. It's all free. It's all surveillance and tracker free. The parts that I host, the parts that are hosted by big internet companies are catastrophic dumpster fires. But mine is tracker free, surveillance free, and ad free. So if you go to pluralistic.net, you'll find the links to all of that. There's a weekly podcast as well where I read some of my journalism. And my books are sold everywhere books are sold. I've got 20 some of them, everything from picture books for 5-year-olds to middle grades graphic novels to young adult novels to nonfiction book length works on technology to science fiction novels for adults. So
Pluralistic, everyone, check it out. Cory, thank you so much for doing this. We'll be back on Monday with another Get Your News On with Ron stream. And in the meantime, you know the drill. Lucy, she says meow, and I say peace. Peace.